My name is Paige. I am 32 years old, and I woke up at exactly 4:15 in the morning to the sound of my life supposedly falling apart. My highly secure phone was vibrating violently against the wooden nightstand, flashing bright red emergency notifications that would make anyone else freeze in pure terror. $20,000 had just vanished in 60 seconds. First, a $5,000 charge at an exclusive designer boutique network triggered the silent alarm. That was followed instantly by a massive $15,000 charge for first-class Emirates flights to Dubai. Most people would panic. Most people would wake their spouses and scream for the police. But when I sprinted down the sweeping mahogany staircase and caught my husband's sister slipping my black credit card back into my leather purse, I did not scream. I just smiled. Because she had no idea what that specific piece of plastic actually was. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a toxic family member who thought they were completely untouchable. The sprawling vacation estate in Atlanta, Georgia, belonged to my father-in-law, Thomas. It was an intimidating fortress built solely to showcase his massive wealth to anyone who walked through the front door. The walls were decorated with expensive modern art, and the floors were covered in imported cold marble that chilled the bottom of my feet. The sweeping mahogany staircase I ran down felt like something out of a luxury magazine, designed to make regular visitors feel small and completely insignificant. My bare feet slapped quietly against the polished wood as I descended into the deep shadows of the first floor. I did not turn on any lights. I let the faint glow of the security lamps outside the tall windows guide me toward the massive gourmet kitchen at the back of the house. My heart was beating a steady, heavy rhythm against my ribs, but it was not from fear or panic. It was from the absolute adrenaline of catching a thief right in the act. When I reached the wide arched doorway of the kitchen, I stopped and stood perfectly still. The large room was dimly lit by the glowing digital displays of stainless steel appliances. Standing by the enormous marble island was Brittany. She is my sister-in-law, 35 years old, and the undisputed golden child of the family. Brittany was wearing a flowing silk robe that probably cost more than my first car. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled even at this ungodly hour of the morning. She had my leather handbag completely open on the marble counter. I watched in total silence as her manicured fingers slid my sleek black credit card back into its designated slot. She snapped the purse shut, let out a soft sigh of relief, and turned around to grab a bottle of sparkling water from the glass front refrigerator. When she closed the heavy refrigerator door, the interior light shut off, plunging the kitchen back into dark shadows. Then she finally saw me standing quietly in the doorway. For a fraction of a second, I saw genuine shock flash across her perfectly pampered face. Her eyes widened, and her grip on the glass bottle tightened so much her knuckles turned white. A normal person caught stealing from a family member in the dead of night would drop to their knees and beg for immediate forgiveness. A normal person would feel immense shame and regret. But Brittany was not a normal person by any measure. She was a woman who had been told her entire life that the rules of society simply did not apply to her. The shock vanished from her face as quickly as it had appeared. She casually unscrewed the metal cap of her sparkling water, took a slow, deliberate sip, and leaned comfortably against the expensive marble counter. She crossed her ankles and looked at me with a cruel smirk that made my blood boil. "What are you doing creeping around in the dark, Paige?" she asked. Her voice was smooth and entirely unbothered, as if we were casually chatting over morning coffee instead of standing in the direct aftermath of a felony crime. "You just put my credit card back in my purse," I said. My voice was completely level and cold. I kept my posture relaxed, leaning slightly against the wooden doorframe. "I received a fraud alert 2 minutes ago. $5,000 for designer clothes and $15,000 for flights to Dubai." I fully expected immediate denial. I expected her to play dumb or claim someone else must have cloned the card somehow. Instead, she took another slow sip of her water and waved her free hand at me dismissively. "Oh, that," she said with a careless, high-pitched laugh. "My card was acting up. The bank flagged it for some stupid security reason because I was making international purchases at 4 in the morning. I just needed to borrow yours to lock in the flight prices before they went up for the day. I will pay you back tomorrow." It is not a big deal at all. Not a big deal. She had just stolen $20,000 while I was sleeping upstairs, and she was treating the entire situation like she had simply borrowed a cup of sugar from a friendly neighbor. You went into my bedroom, went through my personal belongings, and committed credit card fraud, I stated calmly. I wanted her to hear the harsh reality of her actions. I wanted to see if there was any shred of morality left inside her mind. Brittany rolled her eyes dramatically toward the ceiling. Her face contorted into a look of absolute boredom and intense annoyance. She stepped away from the kitchen counter and walked closer to me, her expensive silk robe flowing behind her like a royal cape. Please do not be so dramatic, Paige, she scoffed loudly. You are always so tense about money. I guess that is what happens when you grow up the way you did. You middle-class people count every single penny like your actual life depends on it. We are family now. What is mine is yours, and what is yours is mine. I told you I will transfer the money to your little bank account in the morning. She looked me up and down, her eyes full of harsh judgment and deep disdain. I was wearing simple cotton pajamas, a stark contrast to her luxurious nightwear. She had always made it very clear that I did not belong in their wealthy world. I was just the ordinary girl. Liam had married an outsider who had not grown up with trust funds and summer homes. Do not be tacky, Paige, she continued, her tone dripping with absolute venom. We do not do screaming matches over money in this family. I am doing you a favor by letting you earn the credit card reward points. It is just pocket change for people like us anyway. Go back to sleep and stop acting like a peasant. She walked right past me, her shoulder intentionally brushing hard against mine. She headed toward the grand staircase, fully believing she had won the confrontation. She was absolutely certain that I would swallow my pride, go back to my room, and stay quiet to avoid upsetting her father and my husband. She thought she had completely dominated the situation. I turned and watched her ascend the sweeping mahogany stairs, her silhouette disappearing into the upper floor of the massive estate. I did not yell after her. I did not run upstairs to wake my husband. I simply walked over to my purse on the kitchen counter, pulled out the sleek black card she had used, and smiled into the darkness. She thought she had stolen a standard bank card from a boring middle-class sister-in-law. She thought she was untouchable, but she had no idea that I worked in cybersecurity for the federal government. She had no idea that the piece of plastic she just used was a heavily monitored bait card designed to catch international money launderers. And she had no idea that by spending that $20,000, she had just triggered a federal investigation that was about to destroy her entire life. The heavy thud of footsteps on the upper landing broke the silence of the massive house. The noise of Brittany slamming her door shut had echoed through the cavernous hallways, waking the one person who ruled this family with an iron fist. Thomas, my father-in-law, and the patriarch of this toxic ecosystem, was descending the grand staircase. He wore a heavy velvet dressing gown over his pajamas, his face twisted into a scowl of annoyance. Thomas demanded absolute perfection and total obedience from everyone around him. He built his real estate empire on ruthlessness and expected his home environment to reflect his immense power. He reached the bottom of the stairs and marched straight into the kitchen. His sharp eyes darted between me and the open doorway where his golden child had just vanished. His jaw clenched tightly as he glared at me. "What in the world is going on down here?" he demanded, his voice a harsh whisper designed to intimidate. "Why are you causing a scene in my house before the sun is even up?" I did not back down. I held up my glowing phone screen, displaying the glaring red transaction alerts so he could see the numbers. "Your daughter just snuck into the kitchen and stole my credit card from my purse," I stated clearly. "She fraudulently charged $20,000, $5,000 on luxury clothes, and $15,000 on first-class flights to Dubai." I caught her putting the card back into my bag. I watched his eyes scan the glowing numbers on my screen. Any decent father would be horrified and demand an immediate explanation. But Thomas simply sighed, rubbed his temples, and looked at me with an expression of utter disgust. He scoffed loudly, waving his hand at the screen as if I were showing him a minor typo. "Are you seriously waking me up over this?" Thomas hissed, taking a step closer to tower over me. "You work some boring government desk job, Paige. You simply do not understand how high society women operate. Brittany has a lifestyle to maintain, and sometimes her accounts take a day to process large transfers. She just borrowed the card to secure a reservation. Stop acting like a stingy peasant. He leaned against the marble island, crossing his arms over his chest. His utter dismissal of a felony crime was staggering. He looked at me exactly the way he looked at the waitstaff at his exclusive country club, like I was an inconvenience polluting his pristine environment. You are making a massive issue out of absolutely nothing. He continued, his tone dripping with sheer contempt. This is exactly why your mother-in-law and I opposed Liam marrying you. You lack class and the fundamental understanding of how wealthy families support each other. You see $20,000, and you panic because you have never had any real money. I will write you a check in the morning and cover your little credit card bill. Now go back to your room and do not say another word about this to anyone. You are ruining my weekend. He turned his back on me, fully expecting me to cower in fear and obey his direct command. He walked back toward the staircase, shaking his head and muttering under his breath about my supposed lack of breeding. I stood alone in the dark kitchen. I did not cry or scream or run upstairs to wake my husband to demand justice. Instead, I let out a slow, quiet breath, and I simply smiled. It was a terrifying, silent smile that spread across my face in the shadows. If Thomas and Brittany knew the absolute truth about my career, their blood would run entirely cold. They truly believed I was a low-level administrative clerk, pushing papers at a boring government agency. That was the cover story I gave them years ago, because explaining the reality of my daily life to people who worshipped superficial wealth was a waste of time. The reality was far different. I was not a low-level clerk. I was a senior cyber fraud investigator for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. My boring desk job involved dismantling international crime syndicates, tracing offshore shell companies, and locking up people who thought their money made them invincible. The sleek black credit card Brittany had so arrogantly swiped from my purse was not a standard consumer bank card. It was a highly specialized piece of government technology. It was a federal bait card. My unit used these specific, heavily monitored honeypots to track high-level international money laundering rings. We designed them to look exactly like exclusive, high-limit, low-level administrative clerk pushing papers at a boring government agency. That was the cover story I gave them years ago, because explaining the reality of my daily life to people who worshipped superficial wealth was a waste of time. The reality was far different. I was not a low-level clerk. I was a senior cyber fraud investigator for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. My boring desk job involved dismantling international crime syndicates, tracing offshore shell companies, and locking up people who thought their money made them invincible. The sleek black credit card Brittany had so arrogantly swiped from my purse was not a standard consumer bank card. It was a highly specialized piece of government technology. It was a federal bait card. My unit used these specific, heavily monitored honeypots to track high-level international money laundering rings. We designed them to look exactly like exclusive high-limit rewards cards to tempt specific targets into making unauthorized transactions. The security protocols hardwired into that specific card were incredibly strict and completely unforgiving. Any unauthorized transaction over $10,000 that was not pre-approved by a federal supervisor automatically triggered a massive security cascade. It did not just decline the charge, it initiated an immediate automated federal freeze on the merchant, the buyer, and any associated bank accounts linked to the transaction footprint. It automatically generated a wire fraud case file and alerted the regional cybercrime division. Brittany thought she was just borrowing money from a weak, poor relative. Thomas thought he could simply write a personal check to cover up his daughter's blatant theft. They believed their wealth shielded them from all consequences. They believed they controlled the entire narrative. But they were completely wrong. The moment Brittany clicked confirm on those first-class tickets to Dubai, she did not just steal money. She committed federal wire fraud across international lines using a government-monitored $10,000 that was not pre-approved by a federal supervisor, automatically triggered a massive security cascade. It did not just decline the charge, it initiated an immediate automated federal freeze on the merchant, the buyer, and any associated bank accounts linked to the transaction footprint. It automatically generated a wire fraud case file and alerted the regional cybercrime division. Brittany thought she was just borrowing money from a weak, poor relative. Thomas thought he could simply write a personal check to cover up his daughter's blatant theft. They believed their wealth shielded them from all consequences. They believed they controlled the entire narrative, but they were completely wrong. The moment Brittany clicked confirm on those first-class tickets to Dubai, she did not just steal money. She committed federal wire fraud across international lines using a government-monitored financial instrument. The automated tracking system had already locked onto her internet protocol address, her devices, and her personal banking details. The digital trap had already snapped shut, pulling tight around her throat. And the best part was that neither of them had the slightest clue about their impending doom. The sound of Thomas retreating up the grand staircase had barely faded when a new presence entered the kitchen. It was Devin, Brittany's husband. He was a tall, broad-shouldered African-American man who carried himself with an insufferable, arrogant swagger that demanded immediate attention. Even at this absurd hour of the morning, Devin treated every room he walked into like a VIP lounge that he personally owned. He strolled through the arched doorway wearing custom Tom Ford silk pajamas that draped perfectly over his frame. The dark fabric caught the dim light, emphasizing the ridiculous level of luxury this family demanded at all times. But what always caught my attention was the massive, heavy Patek Philippe watch strapped tightly to his left wrist. Devin loved to flash that watch in everyone's face during family dinners, bragging about how much it cost and how exclusive the waiting list was. But my trained investigator eyes had analyzed it months ago. The sweeping motion of the second hand was entirely wrong, and the weight distribution was visibly off whenever he moved his arm. It was a cheap counterfeit, a shiny fake wrapped around the wrist of a man whose entire life was an elaborate illusion. Devin walked right up to the massive marble island, leaning over it, with a lazy, condescending smile plastered across his face. He acted as though $20,000 being stolen in the middle of the night was nothing more than a hilarious little misunderstanding between friends. He reached into the pocket of his designer pajamas and pulled out a thick silver money clip stuffed with crisp, uncirculated $100 bills. He did not ask for an explanation. He did not apologize for his wife committing a federal crime. Instead, he simply peeled off 20 bills with practiced ease and carelessly tossed the $2,000 across the smooth marble surface toward me. "Take it, sister-in-law," Devin said, his deep voice dripping with mock sympathy and sheer arrogance. "I just closed a multi-million-dollar crypto hedge fund deal." Brittany's $20,000 being stolen in the middle of the night was nothing more than a hilarious little misunderstanding between friends. He reached into the pocket of his designer pajamas and pulled out a thick silver money clip stuffed with crisp, uncirculated $100 bills. He did not ask for an explanation. He did not apologize for his wife committing a federal crime. Instead, he simply peeled off 20 bills with practiced ease and carelessly tossed the $2,000 across the smooth marble surface toward me. "Take it, sister-in-law," Devin said, his deep voice dripping with mock sympathy and sheer arrogance. "I just closed a multi-million-dollar crypto hedge fund deal. Brittany's limit is just temporarily maxed out. Buy yourself something nice and stop stressing my wife." I stared at the scattered bills resting on the cold stone. $2,000 to silence me over a $20,000 theft. This was the suffocating reality of marrying into this family. They worshipped money above all else, treating cash as the ultimate cure for any moral failing or criminal behavior. In their twisted ecosystem, whoever held the biggest bank account dictated the rules of reality. Devin had positioned himself as the ultimate provider of wealth, dazzling my in-laws, $2,000 to silence me over a $20,000 theft. This was the suffocating reality of marrying into this family. They worshipped money above all else, treating cash as the ultimate cure for any moral failing or criminal behavior. In their twisted ecosystem, whoever held the biggest bank account dictated the rules of reality. Devin had positioned himself as the ultimate provider of wealth, dazzling my in-laws with aggressive buzzwords about blockchain, unregulated offshore accounts, and massive returns on investment. He threw cash at problems and expected everyone to blindly worship the ground he walked on. And the tragic part was that this family absolutely did. They bowed to his fake watch and his empty promises because their greed completely blinded them to the obvious red flags. They were willing to overlook anything as long as the money kept flowing in their direction. I could see the absolute confidence radiating from him as he stood there waiting for me to eagerly snatch up the cash. Before I could tell Devin exactly where he could shove his counterfeit money, rushed footsteps echoed from the hallway. Liam, my husband of 4 years, finally hurried into the kitchen. He looked frantic, his hair messy and his eyes wide with sheer panic. But that panic was not directed at the man who was currently insulting me, or the woman who had just robbed me. His terror was entirely directed at the possibility of upsetting the fragile family hierarchy. Liam was a man who spent his entire life shrinking himself to fit into his father's demanding shadow. He had learned early on that survival in this house meant keeping your head down, abandoning your principles, and never questioning the golden child or her chosen spouse. Liam did not stand beside me. He did not confront Devin for treating his wife like a cheap nuisance. Instead, Liam rushed forward and physically grabbed my arm, pulling me back away from the marble island and the scattered money. His grip was tight, his posture hunched and submissive as he glanced nervously at Devin. Devin manages Dad's entire retirement portfolio. Liam hissed at me in a desperate, pleading whisper, pulling me further into the shadows of the kitchen. Don't make him mad. Paige, please just let it go. I looked down at my husband's hand gripping my arm. I felt a wave of absolute disgust wash over me. This was the man who had promised to protect and cherish me, completely abandoning me to appease a loudmouth con artist. Liam was so terrified of losing his secure spot in the family business that he was willing to let his own wife be robbed and humiliated without saying a single word in my defense. His spineless posture contrasted sharply with Devin's inflated ego. Devin stood tall across the island, his chest puffed out, smirking in absolute triumph as he watched my own husband silence me. Liam was doing exactly what Devin and Brittany expected. He was forcing me to swallow the abuse to maintain the illusion of family harmony. I gently but firmly pulled my arm out of Liam's trembling grasp. I did not reach for the $2,000 resting on the cold marble. I let the crisp $100 resting on the cold marble. I let the crisp $100 bills sit there as a pathetic monument to their arrogance. Devin let out a deep, rumbling laugh that echoed through the large room. He clearly thought my silence meant I had surrendered just like Liam had. He picked up his glass of water, gave me a mocking toast, and confidently strutted out of the kitchen, leaving me alone with my cowardly husband. Liam let out a heavy sigh of relief, entirely unaware that his beloved family was dancing blindly on the absolute edge of total destruction. The sun rose over the sprawling Atlanta estate, casting long golden shadows across the manicured lawns. Hours had passed since the incident in the dark kitchen, but the suffocating tension remained trapped inside the walls. By 9 o'clock, luxury catering vans arrived, unloading silver chafing dishes for the scheduled weekend brunch. The driveway quickly filled with expensive sports cars. Aunts, uncles, and wealthy friends poured into the grand foyer, kissing cheeks and loudly complimenting designer outfits. The contrast was nauseating. Just 5 hours ago, a federal felony had been committed under this exact roof. Now it was just another glamorous Saturday morning for a family completely detached from reality. At the center of this superficial circus stood my mother-in-law, Barbara. She wore a pristine white silk pantsuit and a heavy pearl necklace, commanding attention the moment she stepped down the stairs. She thrived on holding an audience captive. She directed the caterers with sharp, impatient snaps of her fingers, making sure everyone knew she was the undisputed queen of this castle. When she spotted me standing quietly near the edge of the dining room, her eyes narrowed. I was dressed in a simple dark green sweater and jeans, holding a plain mug of black coffee. I did not fit into her pristine pastel-colored aesthetic, and she hated me for it. I knew she had already spoken to Thomas. I knew they had quickly formulated a strategy to protect their golden child. What I did not expect was the sheer audacity of the lie Barbara was about to feed her wealthy guests. Barbara glided across the room carrying a fresh mimosa. She purposefully positioned herself in the very center of the main seating area, surrounded by a captive audience of gossiping relatives and elite business associates. She raised her crystal glass and let out a loud theatrical sigh that immediately drew everyone's attention. "It is just so exhausting trying to integrate new people into our social circle," Barbara announced. Her voice carried effortlessly over the soft classical music playing in the background. She looked directly at me, making sure every single person in the room followed her gaze. I simply stood there, both hands wrapped around my warm coffee mug, waiting for her to drop the axe. "Did you all hear what Liam's wife did this morning?" Barbara asked the crowd. She took a slow sip of her drink, feigning deep sympathy, while her eyes burned with pure malice. "Brittany is currently packing for a spontaneous, luxurious getaway to Dubai with Devon. The poor girl was just trying to organize her travel itinerary when Paige practically forced her credit card into Brittany's hands. Paige begged my daughter to use it to buy those expensive first-class Emirates tickets." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Several aunts shook their heads, whispering to each other behind their manicured hands. I stared at Barbara, amazed by her absolute lack of shame. She was taking a blatant, undeniable act of theft and completely rewriting reality. She was turning Brittany, the arrogant thief, into a burdened victim who was just trying to appease an annoying relative. "I tried to tell Brittany to decline the money," Barbara continued, waving her hand dramatically. "But you know how sweet and accommodating my daughter is. Paige was absolutely desperate to pay for those flights. She thinks that throwing thousands of dollars at my daughter will somehow buy her a legitimate place in our elite social circle. It is honestly quite embarrassing to watch someone try so hard to purchase class." Liam was standing near the patio doors holding a plate of pastries. He heard every single word his mother said. He looked down at his feet, entirely unwilling to defend his wife against this brutal character assassination. He was letting his mother destroy my reputation just to protect his sister from the consequences of her own criminal actions. Barbara noticed her audience hanging on to her every word, and she leaned into the cruelty with evident delight. She decided to use the most sensitive parts of my background as ammunition, twisting the hard work I had put into my life into a pathetic character flaw. She turned her body fully toward me, projecting her voice so even the catering staff could hear her vicious assessment. "Paige always struggled with fitting in since she paid her own way through state college," Barbara announced to the room. She shook her head with a look of manufactured pity. "It is sad, really, how she tries to buy our affection. She did not have the pedigree or the Ivy League experiences that the rest of us share. When you grow up having to scrape together pennies for tuition, you develop this desperate need for validation. We do not need her money, of course, but we accept it because we feel bad for her." The guests nodded in agreement, casting side glances in my direction. They looked at me as if I were a tragic charity case, a desperate social climber who was hopelessly out of her depth. They believed every single word Barbara spun because it fit perfectly into their arrogant worldview. I did not react. I did not raise my voice to defend my honor. I did not march into the center of the room and scream the truth about Brittany sneaking around in the dark to steal my card. I just stood there completely still, leaning against the archway. I raised my ceramic mug and took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. The dark, bitter liquid matched my mood perfectly. I endured the public humiliation with absolute unflinching restraint. Every cruel remark Barbara threw at me, and every cowardly glance from my husband meant absolutely nothing. While Barbara was busy putting on a theatrical performance in her lavish dining room, the federal gears were already turning at maximum speed in the background. Automated servers were processing the financial data generated by that $20,000 charge. Federal agents were actively receiving raw intelligence alerts concerning the fraudulent transaction. The bait had been swallowed whole. I simply took another sip of my coffee, savoring the absolute certainty that the trap was closing tighter by the second. The ceramic of my mug was still warm against my palms when a heavy hand clamped down hard on my shoulder. I turned my head to see Thomas looming over me. The forced, polite smile he had been wearing for his wealthy guests was completely gone, replaced by a cold, hard glare that promised immediate punishment. He demanded my attention. In a low, gravelly whisper that barely masked his simmering rage, he ordered me to follow him to his private study. I set my coffee mug down on a nearby silver tray and followed him away from the noisy brunch crowd. Thomas's private study was the physical manifestation of his absolute control over this family. It was a suffocating, windowless room paneled in dark, heavy mahogany. The air inside was thick and oppressive, smelling strongly of expensive cigars and aged leather. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with thick business books that looked like they had never actually been opened. A massive oak desk sat squarely in the center of the room, positioned to make anyone standing on the opposite side feel incredibly small. Thomas walked behind the desk and sat down in his high-backed leather chair. He did not offer me a seat. He wanted me standing, feeling entirely beneath him. Thomas's private study was the physical manifestation of his absolute control over this family. It was a suffocating, windowless room paneled in dark, heavy mahogany. The air inside was thick and oppressive, smelling strongly of expensive cigars and aged leather. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with thick business books that looked like they had never actually been opened. A massive oak desk sat squarely in the center of the room, positioned to make anyone standing on the opposite side feel incredibly small. Thomas walked behind his desk and sat down in his high-backed leather chair. He did not offer me a seat. He wanted me standing, feeling entirely beneath him. He opened the top drawer of his desk and pulled out a single sheet of crisp white paper. He slapped it down onto the polished oak surface and slid it across the desk toward me. I stepped forward and looked down at the document. The bold black letters at the top read, "Gift Affidavit." I scanned the typed paragraphs below. The document explicitly stated that I voluntarily and joyfully gifted the sum of $20,000 to my sister-in-law Brittany. It included legal jargon, waiving my right to dispute the charge, claiming the funds were a personal family contribution for her upcoming travel expenses. Thomas had actually taken the time to have his corporate lawyers draft a fraudulent legal document on a Saturday morning just to cover up his daughter's felony theft. I kept my face completely blank. I am not signing a sworn affidavit that turns a blatant theft into a voluntary gift, I replied evenly. Thomas slammed his hands flat against the oak desk, propelling himself forward. His face flushed a deep, angry red. "You will do exactly as I say," he snarled, dropping the quiet patriarch act entirely. "Let me make this incredibly clear for you, Paige. Sign this or I fire Liam from the family firm today. You will both be on the street." I stared at him, taking in the absolute malice in his eyes. He was perfectly willing to destroy his own son's career and livelihood just to protect Brittany. He viewed Liam not as a son, but as an employee he could leverage to control me. "You are replaceable, Paige," Thomas continued, his voice dripping with pure venom. "My daughter is not. Liam is weak. He relies on my paycheck, my connections, and my goodwill to survive. If I cut him off, he will blame you. Your marriage will collapse under the weight of financial ruin. You can either be a supportive wife and sign that paper, or you can walk out of this house with absolutely nothing." He picked up an expensive gold fountain pen and held it out toward me. The gold caught the dim light of the study, a shiny tool meant to secure my complete submission. I was absolutely certain he had won. He believed he had found my breaking point, assuming that the threat of poverty and divorce would break my spirit. I looked at the gold pen. I looked at the fraudulent gift affidavit. Then I looked at the man who thought he controlled the universe. A cold, calculated calm washed over my entire body. As a federal cyber fraud investigator, I dealt with legal documents, sworn affidavits, and forged signatures on a daily basis. I knew exactly what made a contract legally binding in a federal court, and more importantly, I knew exactly what rendered a document completely inadmissible as evidence. I reached out and took the gold pen from his hand. Thomas let out a short, triumphant breath, sinking back into his leather chair with a smug, satisfied smirk. He thought he had just broken me. I reached out and took the gold pen from his hand. Thomas let out a short, triumphant breath, sinking back into his leather chair with a smug, satisfied smirk. He thought he had just broken me. I capped the gold pen and dropped it onto the desk. "There," I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat and compliant. "It is signed." Thomas snatched the paper off the desk, glancing at the bottom line. He did not inspect it closely. His arrogance prevented him from even entertaining the idea that I would dare to deceive him. He shoved the paper inside his desk drawer and locked it securely with a small brass key. I did not connect to Thomas's unsecured home wireless network. Doing so would be amateurish and highly dangerous. Instead, I activated the encrypted satellite uplink embedded in the laptop chassis. A secure tunnel established a direct connection to the federal servers in Washington. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing lines of command code to bypass the standard commercial firewalls and access the restricted financial tracking database. The dark screen flashed to life, displaying a cascading wall of green text. I entered the unique 16-digit identifier for the specific bait card Brittany had stolen. The tracking interface populated instantly. The system had already done the heavy lifting, isolating the exact digital footprints of the morning's fraudulent activity. I brought up the transaction log. There it was. $5,000 processed through a boutique payment gateway at exactly 4:15. But I did not care about the clothes. I needed the flight data. I isolated the $15,000 Emirates transaction and initiated a deep trace on the routing numbers. The digital hunt was exhilarating. It felt exactly like kicking down a door in a physical raid, but infinitely faster. I followed the money through the Emirates booking portal. The system mapped the purchase data, cross-referencing passenger manifests against the payment source. The terminal window displayed the confirmed passenger names in bright white text: Brittany and Devon. They had booked 2 one-way first-class tickets to Dubai, scheduled to depart at 6 in the morning on Monday. One-way tickets. That detail screamed flight risk. People like Devon and Brittany did not book sudden one-way trips to non-extradition countries just for a weekend getaway. They were running from something massive. The $20,000 stolen from my purse was not a careless shopping spree. It was a desperate, chaotic attempt to secure an escape route because their primary funds were suddenly inaccessible. I needed to know exactly why Devon was running. I minimized the transaction window and opened the Federal Financial Crimes database. I typed Devon's full legal name into the search bar, followed by the name of the boutique cryptocurrency hedge fund he constantly bragged about at family dinners. Devon loved to talk about his massive returns and exclusive client list. He used complex financial jargon to intimidate Thomas and impress his wealthy friends. But data never lies. I bypassed the glossy, superficial corporate websites he had built to market his business and dived straight into the raw corporate registries. The search engine scrubbed through state and federal tax records looking for legitimate business licenses. The result came back negative. I ran it again, querying the Securities and Exchange Commission database. If Devon was managing millions of dollars in investment portfolios, he was legally required to be registered as a licensed broker with the SEC. The Federal Registry returned 0 results. Devon was a phantom. The thrill of the chase accelerated. I felt the familiar rush of tearing down a criminal facade piece by piece. If the hedge fund did not legally exist, where was the money going? I initiated a hostile trace on the banking routing numbers listed on Devon's flashy corporate brochures. The software hammered against the commercial banking firewalls, slicing through the thin security layers in seconds. I hit the motherlode. Devon had set up a complex web of shell companies. The money from his Atlanta investors flowed into a domestic holding account, but it did not stay there. My screen filled with a chaotic spider web of transaction lines. He was funneling the cash through a dozen dummy corporations, layering the transactions to hide the original source. The endpoint of this digital maze was an offshore banking network located in the Cayman Islands. I pulled the ledger data from the offshore accounts. It was a classic textbook Ponzi scheme. Devon was not investing a single dime in cryptocurrency or real estate. He was taking massive deposits from new investors and using that exact same cash to pay fake dividends to his early backers, skimming a massive percentage off the top to fund his designer pajamas and fake luxury watches. But the offshore accounts were rapidly draining. The incoming investments had stopped, and the required payouts were due on Monday. The fund was completely insolvent. The entire empire was built on air, and the bubble was set to violently burst in less than 48 hours. He had stolen Thomas's entire retirement portfolio and hidden it behind a wall of fake digital ledgers. Devin was a cheap con artist who had manipulated my arrogant father-in-law, and now he was trying to use my stolen credit card to finance his grand escape before the authorities could catch him. The trap was set perfectly. I smiled at the glowing computer screen now. The sheer magnitude of the financial crimes began to unfold before my eyes in terrifying detail. I leaned closer to the monitor and pulled up the victim ledger, hidden deep within his encrypted server network. He was not just skimming off the top of a few isolated investments. Devin had systematically targeted the wealthiest families in the entire Atlanta metropolitan area. These were people who trusted him implicitly because he wore the right suits and attended the right galas. I weaponized his proximity to my father-in-law to easily gain access to an exclusive network of millionaires and billionaires. Devin had built a classic Ponzi scheme. He promised these elite investors absurdly high returns on their capital by claiming he had proprietary access to emerging foreign cryptocurrency markets. But there were no markets. There were no digital assets. Every time a new investor wired funds into his domestic holding account, Devin immediately routed that cash back out to pay the supposed dividends to his earlier investors. He kept the wheels spinning by constantly recruiting new victims at high society events. But as I dug deeper into the transaction logs, my blood ran completely cold with pure and absolute shock. I isolated the primary funding source that had initially launched his fake hedge fund 3 years ago. The account numbers matched a massive wire transfer from a traditional private wealth management firm. I cross-referenced the account holder information, and the name flashed across my screen in bright green letters: Thomas. My arrogant and overbearing father-in-law was not just an early investor in this massive scam. He was the primary victim holding the entire house of cards together. Devin had completely drained every single cent of his heavily guarded retirement accounts without showing a shred of genuine human remorse. I opened another encrypted file folder labeled as real estate holdings and gasped at the sheer audacity of the betrayal. Devin had convinced Thomas to sign over power of attorney for his investment portfolio under the guise of maximizing his returns. Using that legal authority, Devin had quietly leveraged the massive Atlanta vacation estate we were currently standing inside. He had taken out massive predatory loans against the property and liquidated his blue-chip stock portfolio just to keep the Ponzi scheme afloat during a bad quarter last year. Thomas thought he was a genius for fully trusting him implicitly. Thomas parroted Devin around at country club dinners and forced Liam to shrink into the background. He had no idea that the man he praised was systematically destroying his entire legacy piece by piece. Thomas was utterly bankrupt, and he did not even know it yet. The final puzzle pieces slammed into place with devastating clarity. The stolen $20,000 at 4 in the morning suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. It was never about Brittany needing to secure a spontaneous vacation or paying for an extravagant shopping spree. The massive Ponzi scheme had finally reached its absolute mathematical limit. The offshore accounts were entirely depleted. I checked the upcoming scheduled distributions on his master ledger. He owed his top-tier investors over $5 million in quarterly dividend payouts by Monday morning. He did not have the cash. He did not even have a fraction of the cash. When Monday morning arrived, those wealthy Atlanta investors would check their accounts. They would see the missing funds and make angry phone calls. They would demand their money back. Within hours, the entire illusion would violently shatter. The police would be called. The federal authorities would be notified without any hesitation. Devin knew the collapse was imminent. He knew he was completely out of time. That was why he and Brittany needed those first-class Emirates tickets immediately. They were planning to flee the country and vanish into Dubai, where extradition laws would make it incredibly difficult for American authorities to drag them back to face justice. They needed untraceable travel funds instantly, but his personal accounts were likely maxed out or already being monitored by nervous creditors. Brittany saw my purse sitting on the kitchen counter and thought she had found the perfect easy solution to their massive financial problem. She viewed me as a pathetic, helpless obstacle she could easily trample over. She assumed I would be too intimidated by Thomas and too desperate for family approval to ever report the fraudulent charge. She thought she could steal my credit card by their escape route and leave the country before I ever mustered the courage to complain. They were going to leave Thomas behind to face the wrath of the defrauded investors. They were going to let my father-in-law take the heavy fall for the leveraged estate and the missing millions stolen from his wealthy friends forever. Brittany was perfectly willing to abandon her own parents to complete financial ruin and absolute public disgrace just to save herself and her criminal husband. It was a level of sociopathic greed that actually impressed me. I sat back in my chair and stared at the dark walls of the guest bedroom. The sheer irony of the situation was almost suffocating. Downstairs, Thomas was currently drinking expensive champagne and mocking my middle-class background, blissfully unaware that he was officially a penniless man standing inside a house he no longer truly owned. Meanwhile, Liam was completely useless and terribly weak. Liam was likely apologizing to everyone for my supposed bad behavior, desperately trying to protect the very people who were actively destroying his future. I reached out and gently closed the lid of my encrypted laptop. The heavy metal chassis clicked shut with a satisfying sound of finality. The federal trap was already set in motion by the automated security protocols on my bait card. I did not need to do anything else to expose them. I just needed to sit back, play the part of the compliant daughter-in-law, and watch the entire toxic ecosystem completely burn down. I sat in the silence of the guest bedroom for only a few minutes before the digital shockwave finally breached the physical world. Deep within the hidden servers of the Department of the Treasury, the automated security protocols of my federal bait card had reached their absolute tipping point. The system did not just flag the $15,000 Emirates transaction. It aggressively traced the digital fingerprint of the device used to make the purchase, instantly mapping the IP address back to Devon and his entire network of fraudulent holdings. The federal algorithm operated with ruthless efficiency. The moment it verified the connection between the stolen government instrument and Devon's banking profile, it initiated a total and irreversible asset freeze. Every single domestic account, every hidden offshore routing number, and every credit line tied to his social security number was instantly locked down by federal mandate. The financial guillotine swung down hard, severing his access to the stolen millions in a fraction of a second. I unlocked the heavy wooden door of the guest bedroom and stepped out into the carpeted hallway. The atmosphere in the massive estate had already shifted dramatically. The dull, polite chatter of wealthy guests enjoying their weekend brunch had been replaced by a sharp, aggressive voice echoing up the grand staircase. It was Devon. He was not using his smooth, confident sales pitch tone anymore. He was shouting frantically. I walked silently down the carpeted steps, staying close to the mahogany railing so I could observe the absolute chaos unfolding in the main living room without being seen. Devon was pacing back and forth across the expensive Persian rug like a trapped animal. The arrogant, untouchable aura he had paraded around the kitchen just a few hours ago had completely evaporated. He was holding his sleek smartphone tightly against his ear, barking desperate orders at whoever was unfortunate enough to be on the other end of the line. I watched as he aggressively raked his free hand over his head. "What do you mean my cards are declined?" Devon yelled into the phone, his voice cracking with rising panic. "Run it again. Run all of them. I am a premier client. You do not decline my purchases." He stopped pacing for a brief second, listening to the response from the bank representative. His broad shoulders suddenly slumped and a look of sheer terror flashed across his face. "Frozen. What do you mean the accounts are frozen by federal order? That is a mistake. You need to override that right now. I have a multi-million-dollar transfer scheduled for tomorrow." He pulled the phone away from his ear and stared at the dark screen in utter disbelief. The bank had hung up on him. The federal freeze was absolute, and customer service representatives were legally prohibited from bypassing a Department of the Treasury lockdown. The fake corporate genius was watching his entire fictional empire disintegrate in real time. He aggressively tapped the screen of his phone, desperately trying to log into his offshore banking portals. I knew exactly what he was seeing. The Cayman Islands wire transfers he had scheduled to move the last remaining scraps of Thomas's retirement funds had violently bounced back. The international gateways were completely blocked. He had zero access to capital. He could not pay his investors, and more importantly, he could not pay for the escape route he so desperately needed. The physical transformation of Devon was staggering to witness. The custom silk pajamas he wore so proudly earlier that morning were now clinging to his large frame, heavily soaked in patches of nervous sweat. The crisp, clean image of a successful hedge fund manager melted away, revealing the desperate cornered con artist hiding underneath. He breathed heavily, his chest heaving as he frantically dialed another number. Brittany rushed into the living room, her face pale and her eyes wide with confusion. She had abandoned her elite brunch guests in the dining room, drawn by the sound of her husband losing his mind. "Devon, what is going on out here?" "Here," she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "People are staring. Keep your voice down." Devon snapped his head toward her, his eyes wild and bloodshot. He did not offer her a comforting smile or reassure her that everything was under control. The illusion of their perfect marriage shattered right alongside his bank accounts. "Do not tell me to keep my voice down," he snarled, taking a threatening step toward his wife. "Every single account is locked. The offshore transfers bounced. The credit cards are dead. We have absolutely nothing right now." Brittany stepped back, raising her hands defensively. "What are you talking about? How can everything be locked? We leave for Dubai tomorrow morning. I secured the tickets just like you asked." Devon let out a harsh, manic laugh that sounded more like a bark. "You secured the tickets," he mocked viciously. "With what money, Brittany?" "Because my banks are telling me there is a federal hold on my profile." "A federal hold? Do you understand what that means?" "They found the routing discrepancy. We are out of time and we are out of money." I stood in the shadows of the staircase, absorbing every single second of their spectacular downfall. The transition from arrogant wealth to sudden, inexplicable panic was absolute poetry. The walls of the lavish estate seemed to close in on them. The expensive modern art and cold marble floors could not protect them from the digital strike that had just annihilated their future. They had spent their entire lives treating people like garbage, believing their stolen money elevated them above the basic laws of society. Now they were standing in the middle of a massive multi-million-dollar mansion completely destitute. The real show was finally beginning for this incredibly toxic family. I leaned comfortably against the polished wooden railing and took a slow, deep breath. Every single piece of their fake empire was crumbling perfectly. I turned away from the staircase and quietly retreated down the hall toward the main kitchen. I needed to position myself perfectly for the inevitable collision. Devon was a cornered animal, and cornered animals eventually follow the scent of their destruction back to the source. It would not take him long to connect his financial lockdown with his wife stealing my credit card. The bank had told him his accounts were flagged because of a federal security trigger linked to a recent transaction. I knew Brittany had used a stolen card to book non-refundable flights to Dubai. The math was incredibly simple, even for a desperate fraudster. I walked over to the massive marble island, poured myself a glass of iced water and waited. Less than 2 minutes later, heavy footsteps pounded furiously down the hallway. Devon stormed through the arched doorway of the kitchen like a massive tidal wave of pure panic and explosive rage. The silk of his designer pajamas was completely drenched in sweat sticking to his broad chest and muscular shoulders. His eyes were wide, frantic, and bloodshot. The arrogant smirk he had worn just a few hours ago was completely wiped away, replaced by the feral, violent glare of a man watching his entire life evaporate into thin air. He spotted me standing calmly by the island and let out a guttural sound of absolute fury. He closed the distance between us in 3 massive strides. Before I could set my glass down, Devon lunged forward. He used his immense physical size to completely block my exit, backing me up until the cold marble island pressed sharply against my lower spine. He slammed both his heavy hands down onto the countertop, trapping me between his muscular arms. The loud crack of his palms hitting the stone echoed sharply in the large room. He leaned in incredibly close. I could feel the heat radiating off his panicked body and smell the sour, bitter scent of intense fear rolling off his skin. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving up and down as he tried to intimidate me with physical force. He thought his size and aggressive posture would make me crumble. "What did you do to that card, you little snake?" Devin hissed. His voice was a harsh, venomous whisper vibrating with absolute malice. "My bank is telling me my accounts are flagged for federal review because of your card. Call your bank and clear it right now, or I swear to God I will ruin you." He leaned in closer, his face just inches from mine. "I will destroy your life, Paige. I will make sure Liam divorces you and leaves you with nothing. You do not mess with my money. Pull out your phone, call the fraud department, and tell them the Emirates transaction was a harmless mistake. Tell them you authorized Brittany to use the card. Do it right this second, or you will deeply regret ever crossing me." He glared down at me, fully expecting me to cower, cry, or desperately reach for my phone to obey his commands. He had spent years watching Thomas and Barbara cater to his every whim, watching Liam shrink away from any confrontation. He assumed I was just another weak, compliant piece on his chessboard. But he had fundamentally miscalculated the situation. I did not flinch. I did not avert my gaze. I did not tremble or show a single ounce of fear. I stood perfectly still, letting his idle threats wash over me like useless empty air. I looked him dead in the eye, maintaining a level of cold, clinical eye contact that immediately made him blink in confusion. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my iced water, letting the silence stretch out and amplify his mounting panic. The more calm I appeared, the more frantic he became. His hands gripped the edge of the marble island so tightly, his knuckles turned completely white. When I finally spoke, my voice was perfectly even, devoid of any emotion or sympathy. "I have absolutely no power to stop this, Devin," I explained. "I am not calling anyone. When a major credit card is used for an unauthorized international purchase of that magnitude at 4 in the morning, it triggers a mandatory automated fraud detection protocol. You claim to be a high-level investment broker. You should intimately understand how modern financial security systems operate." He stared at me, his jaw clenching in extreme frustration. I continued my explanation with cold surgical precision. The banking network automatically flagged the transaction as a severe security risk. The moment Brittany clicked purchase on those Dubai tickets, the system froze the merchant gateway and traced the internet protocol address directly back to your network. Because she used your connected devices and your financial profiles to route the booking, the automated system locked down everything tied to your name. It is a standard protective measure to prevent international capital flight. The bank is not going to lift a federal freeze just because I call a representative and say I changed my mind. The investigation is already completely out of my hands. The Federal Compliance Department has taken full control of the security alert. Devin shook his head rapidly, absolutely refusing to accept the harsh reality. "You are lying," he growled. "You are just a spiteful, jealous clerk trying to ruin my weekend. You are going to fix this. You are going to unlock my accounts, Paige. If your accounts are legitimate as you constantly claim, then you have nothing to worry about," I replied flatly. "A legitimate multi-million-dollar hedge fund manager would simply provide the necessary documentation to the review board and wait it out. So why exactly are you sweating through your expensive designer pajamas over a routine security audit?" Before Devin could formulate a lie to explain his sheer panic, a frantic blur of motion exploded into the kitchen. Brittany burst through the archway, her chest heaving as she sprinted toward us. The perfectly poised society woman from the brunch upstairs was completely gone. Her designer makeup was smudged under her wide, terrified eyes. She had clearly just spoken to her husband and realized the absolute gravity of their frozen accounts. Her luxurious lifestyle was evaporating, and she was desperate to salvage the escape plan. Brittany did not even acknowledge Devin trapping me against the marble island. She marched straight over to the wooden counter where my leather purse was sitting. With a vicious shriek of frustration, she grabbed the bottom of my bag and violently turned it upside down. She dumped the entire contents of my purse directly onto the hard tile floor. My keys, my makeup, my wallet, and my secure federal smartphone clattered loudly against the stone. She dropped to her knees, frantically clawing through my personal belongings like a starving scavenger. Her perfectly manicured nails scraped against the tiles as she aggressively snatched up my phone. She scrambled back to her feet and shoved the glowing screen directly into my face. Unlock this right now! Brittany screamed. Her voice echoed sharply off the high ceilings, completely shattering the quiet atmosphere of the estate. You are going to call your pathetic little bank and tell them you authorized the flight purchase. You are going to fix this page. Do you have any idea what you are doing to us? You are destroying everything. Unlock the phone and dial the fraud department this second. She jabbed the glass screen toward my nose. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably. The sheer audacity of her demanding my help while holding the phone she just ripped from my dumped purse was astounding. She had stolen from me, lied about it to a crowd of wealthy guests, and now she was demanding I save her from the consequences. You cannot bully a bank algorithm into ignoring a felony, I said calmly, refusing to look at the phone's screen. The federal security hold requires official verification. Calling a customer service hotline on a Saturday morning will accomplish absolutely nothing. Brittany let out a loud, frustrated scream and threw my phone onto the marble island. It slid across the smooth surface and hit Devin in the chest. He grabbed it, his eyes darting frantically around the kitchen as he searched for another way to force my compliance. The tension in the room was suffocating. I was trapped between a desperate con artist and a hysterical thief. The chaotic noise finally drew the attention of the one person I had expected to intervene hours ago. Liam hurried into the kitchen. My husband stopped dead in his tracks, taking in the scene before him. He saw my purse completely emptied on the floor. He saw Brittany sobbing hysterically, clutching the edge of the island. And he saw Devin, a massive and physically intimidating man, actively trapping me against the counter, blocking my only exit. Any decent husband would have rushed forward immediately. Any normal man would have grabbed Devin by the collar and thrown him across the room for threatening his wife. I waited for Liam to finally step up, to finally show a single ounce of courage. Instead, Liam looked at Devin, terrified, angry face, and immediately shrank back. He lowered his shoulders, submitting completely to the alpha of the house. He refused to look me in the eye. "Just call the bank, Paige," Liam pleaded, his voice whining and incredibly weak. He wrung his hands together nervously, taking a step toward his sister instead of me. "You are ruining Devin's business deals. You know how important this weekend is for the family portfolio. Why do you always have to be so difficult? Just do what they are asking so we can all go back to the brunch." I stared at Liam. The absolute betrayal in his words severed whatever tiny fragile thread still connected me to our marriage. He was not asking me to compromise for the sake of peace. He was actively participating in my abuse. He was enabling a physical threat against his own wife just to ensure he did not upset the family dynamic. He cared more about Devon's fake hedge fund and his father approval than he cared about my basic safety. I looked at the three of them standing there, Devon towering over me with violent intent, Brittany crying tears of pure selfish panic, Liam begging me to submit to their demands. They were a perfect triangle of toxic manipulation. They honestly believed they could break me if they applied enough pressure. But I was not an ordinary wife dealing with a family dispute. I was a federal agent actively managing a live criminal operation. My brain processed the situation with cold tactical efficiency. The automated trap had frozen Devon's funds, but I needed the FBI tactical team to physically arrive and secure the premises before these two attempted to flee the property entirely. If Devon realized the absolute truth that the federal government was already watching his every move, he would run. He would leave Brittany behind, hijack a car, and vanish before the authorities could establish a perimeter. I needed to keep him right here in this house. I needed to give him a false sense of hope. I needed to buy time. I let out a heavy, defeated sigh. I allowed my shoulders to slump, mirroring Liam's weak posture. I looked down at the floor, feigning total surrender. I let them believe they had successfully broken my spirit. "Fine," I whispered, keeping my voice soft and defeated. "The phone application will not work. The bank requires secure web verification for international fraud holds. Let me get my laptop. I will log into the banking portal and clear the security flag." Devon sneers, thinking he has won. He steps back from the marble island, adjusting the collar of his sweat-soaked silk pajamas with a triumphant huff. He gestures aggressively toward the hallway, commanding me to move. Liam quickly steps out of the way, keeping his head lowered, eager to appease the man who holds his father's fictional wealth. Brittany scoops up my phone from the counter and shoves it into my hands, her manicured fingers trembling with residual panic. I walk past all of them without making eye contact, keeping my posture defeated and my shoulders slumped. I retrieve my heavy matte black laptop from the locked guest bedroom and carry it downstairs to the massive formal dining room. The grand dining table is a long expanse of polished cherry wood, surrounded by high-backed chairs upholstered in expensive velvet. I sit at the head of the table. Devin immediately flanks me on my right side, looming over my shoulder to monitor my every move. Brittany paces nervously on my left, biting her fingernails. Liam stands near the doorway, hovering like a frightened spectator too afraid to enter the actual arena. The atmosphere in the room is suffocating. They are glaring at me, an impatient, toxic trio united by their desperate greed and complete lack of morality. I open the heavy lid of the laptop. The biometric scanner verifies my fingerprint in a fraction of a second, booting up the encrypted interface. To the untrained eye, my screen looks entirely ordinary. I deliberately open a standard commercial web browser and navigate to a generic consumer banking homepage. I type my credentials slowly, letting them see the familiar blue and white logo of a major national bank. Devin leans closer, his heavy breathing warming the side of my neck. Hai is watching the screen like a hawk, desperate to see the security flag lifted so he can salvage his escape plan to Dubai. But Devin is a financial con artist, not a cybersecurity expert. He has absolutely no idea that the commercial browser taking up the center of my screen is nothing more than a superficial visual shell beneath the banking portal, hidden entirely from their view. I am running a covert background terminal connected directly to a secure federal server. My fingers move steadily across the keyboard, while my right hand uses the trackpad to slowly navigate the fake banking menus. My left hand inputs rapid command strings, using keyboard shortcuts. I open a direct encrypted messaging channel to my unit chief at the Federal Bureau of Investigation headquarters in Washington. The tactical interface operates silently. I do not need to look at the hidden command line to know what I am doing. I type a high-priority alert code. The message transmits instantly. I attach the massive data packet I compiled earlier in the guest bedroom. The upload includes the complete dossier on Devin and his entire criminal enterprise. I attach his master Ponzi scheme ledger, exposing the millions he stole from Thomas and the other wealthy Atlanta investors. I attach the detailed banking logs, showing the rapid depletion of his offshore Cayman Islands accounts. I attach the concrete proof of his immediate flight risk, specifically the 2 first-class Emirates tickets to Dubai that Brittany purchased using my stolen federal bait card at 4:15 this morning. Finally, I attach the real-time trigger data from the card itself, providing the undeniable digital footprint that ties the entire fraudulent network directly to Devin. The data packet is massive, but the military-grade satellite uplink processes the transmission in seconds. I keep my face perfectly blank, staring blankly at the spinning loading wheel on the fake banking website. Brittany lets out an irritated sigh. "Why is this taking so long?" she demands, tapping her foot against the hardwood floor. "Make it load faster, Paige. We do not have time for this." "The servers are busy," I reply calmly, my eyes fixed on the screen. It is a Saturday morning. International security reviews require multiple layers of digital authentication. Devin slams his hand on the back of my chair. "Just bypass the review and authorize the charge. You are the account holder. Tell the automated system it was a valid purchase." I nod slowly, acting as though I am following his exact instructions. I click a series of fake verification buttons on the consumer website. In reality, I am watching a tiny, almost invisible pixel in the bottom right corner of my screen. This is my direct line to the unit chief. If the pixel turns red, it means the evidence is insufficient, or the tactical request is denied. If the pixel turns green, it means the federal raid is officially authorized and local field offices are moving in. The tension in the dining room reaches an absolute boiling point. Liam shifts his weight anxiously from foot to foot in the doorway. Brittany resumes her frantic pacing. Devin glares at the screen, a bead of sweat tracing down his jawline. The silence is broken only by the sound of my keyboard and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. 10 seconds pass, then 20. Suddenly, the tiny pixel in the bottom corner of my screen flashes a bright, discrete green. My heart gives a powerful, triumphant thump. The operation is officially greenlit. The data packet provided overwhelming probable cause. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has authorized a full-scale tactical raid on the estate. Heavily armed federal agents are currently mobilizing from the Atlanta field office. The tactical teams are gearing up, loading into armored vehicles, and preparing to breach the perimeter of this lavish, toxic fortress. The net is closing, and there is absolutely no escape. I close the black laptop. The click echoes sharply. Devin stiffens instantly. "What are you doing?" he barks. I face him directly. "It is processing," I tell Devin, delivering the final lie. "It might take 24 hours to clear." Devin's face twisted into pure, suppressed rage. He stormed out of the dining room, cursing under his breath, desperately trying to calculate how to survive. Brittany trailed right behind him, whining about packing her designer luggage. I simply packed up my laptop and prepared for the final act. Saturday evening arrived with a suffocating sense of grand delusion. Thomas was hosting a massive, fully catered gala at his exclusive country club in the heart of Buckhead. The official reason for this extravagant party was to celebrate Devin and his supposed record-breaking quarter. In reality, Thomas was throwing a celebration to honor the exact man who had just liquidated his entire estate. The irony was thick. I stepped out of the hired black car and looked up at the towering columns of the country club. Valets rushed back and forth, parking a parade of Ferraris, Bentleys, and custom Mercedes. Every person walking up those wide, marble steps represented another victim of the Ponzi scheme. They were all dressed in tailored tuxedos and custom evening gowns, blissfully unaware that the ground beneath their feet was about to collapse. Inside the grand ballroom, the display of wealth was nothing short of grotesque. Enormous crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over hundreds of guests. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with imported beluga caviar and delicate truffle appetizers. Towers of expensive champagne flowed freely, the clinking of crystal glasses, creating a constant glittering soundtrack to the evening. Massive floral arrangements made of rare white orchids decorated every single table. I walked through the room, taking in every lavish detail, knowing exactly how all of this was being funded. Thomas had spared no expense, believing his immense wealth had doubled under Devin's financial genius. He was literally partying on the ashes of his own ruined legacy. Devin stood near the main bar, gripping a glass of scotch so tightly I thought the crystal might shatter. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo, but his eyes darted nervously toward the heavy oak doors every time someone new entered the room. He tried desperately to maintain his confident, untouchable facade, but the sweat glistening on his forehead betrayed his absolute terror. The clock was ticking, and he knew it perfectly well. While Devin silently panicked, Brittany was putting on the performance of a lifetime. She paraded around the center of the ballroom in a stunning floor-length emerald green gown that easily cost $5,000. The silk fabric caught the chandelier light perfectly as she glided from group to group, ensuring every wealthy guest noticed her presence. She had a glass of expensive champagne in one hand and waved the other around to emphasize her points. I stood near a towering ice sculpture and listened as she loudly bragged to a circle of elite socialites. "Oh yes, Devin and I are taking a completely spontaneous trip to Dubai," she announced, throwing her head back with a loud theatrical laugh. "We decided just this morning. When you have our kind of flexibility, you simply have to seize the moment. We are flying first class, of course. We plan to look at some luxury real estate while we are there." The other women nodded with envious smiles, completely captivated by her glamorous narrative. Brittany was basking in their jealousy, genuinely believing she was the undisputed queen of Atlanta high society. She was bragging about a desperate escape plan, funded by a stolen credit card, completely blind to the fact that her luxurious future had already been erased by a federal algorithm. My mother-in-law Barbara was also in her absolute element. She wore a heavy diamond necklace that matched her icy, judgmental stare. She floated through the crowd, greeting prominent judges, local politicians, and wealthy real estate developers. Whenever she spotted me standing quietly by myself, she made it a specific point to bring her high-profile guests over to humiliate me. She grabbed the arm of a state senator and dragged him toward my corner of the room. "Senator, I do not believe you have formally met my son's wife, Paige," Barbara said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She patted my shoulder with cold, stiff fingers. "Paige is Liam's little administrative assistant. She pushes papers at some boring government desk downtown. We keep hoping she will eventually find a real passion, but you know how it is. Not everyone is built for success like our Devon." The senator gave me a polite, pitying smile, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to correct the powerful matriarch. I did not flinch. I did not correct her or defend my career. I simply smiled pleasantly and offered a polite nod to the senator. "That sounds like very steady work," the senator offered diplomatically. I smiled wider. "It is incredibly steady," I replied, maintaining a perfectly even tone. "I specialize in cleaning up messes. We are having a very busy weekend." Barbara scoffed, rolling her eyes at my response. She quickly steered the senator away, eager to show him the ice sculpture, carved to look like a stock market bull. She strutted away, feeling victorious, absolutely certain she had put me in my lowly place. I watched her walk away, my heart beating with a calm focus. Let them drink the expensive champagne. Let them eat the imported caviar. Let them brag about their fake wealth and their stolen tickets. They thought they were invincible, standing at the top of the social hierarchy. But I knew the truth. The green light on my encrypted laptop meant the tactical vehicles were already rolling through the city streets. The federal agents were checking their weapons and coordinating the perimeter breach. The grand, arrogant celebration echoing around me was nothing more than the final gasp of a dying criminal empire. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, relishing the glorious irony of it all, as the final countdown to their destruction silently ticked away. A sharp, piercing chime cut through the low hum of the ballroom as Thomas strode onto the elevated stage at the far end of the hall. He tapped a silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute, demanding absolute silence from the hundreds of wealthy guests. The gentle classical music faded away immediately. Waiters stopped in their tracks, holding heavy silver trays of hors d'oeuvres perfectly still. Everyone turned their attention to the patriarch of the family. Thomas stood under the glare of a bright spotlight radiating pure arrogance. He adjusted his tailored tuxedo jacket and puffed out his chest, looking down at the crowd as if he were a king addressing his loyal subjects. He believed he was at the absolute peak of his financial power. He had no idea he was standing on a trapdoor. "Thank you all for joining us tonight," Thomas bellowed into the microphone. His deep voice echoed off the high gilded ceilings of the country club. "We are gathered here to celebrate unparalleled success. In a world where most men are too afraid to take bold risks, it takes a true visionary to step forward and secure a family legacy. And that is exactly what my son-in-law has done." Thomas dramatically extended his right arm, pointing directly at Devon, who was standing right near the front of the stage. Devon forced a stiff, unnatural smile, but his eyes were darting wildly around the room. He looked like a man standing right in front of a firing squad. "Devon is the absolute smartest man I know," Thomas proclaimed proudly, completely blind to the sheer terror radiating from the man he was praising. "He took my investments and transformed them into an unstoppable financial engine. He has secured our wealth for generations to come. He is a financial genius, a trailblazer, and the very savior of this family legacy. Please everyone raise a glass to Devon." The ballroom erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause. Hundreds of crystal glasses clinked together in a massive wave of blind admiration. Brittany stood beside her husband, beaming with immense pride. She waved at her wealthy friends, soaking in the praise as if she had earned every single drop of it. Devon raised his own glass, but his hand was visibly shaking. The amber liquid inside his crystal tumbler sloshed back and forth, splashing slightly over the rim and onto his expensive shoes. He quickly took a very large gulp, trying to steady his trembling nerves. Thomas held up his hands, signaling the crowd to quiet down so he could continue his pompous speech. He was not finished basking in the glory of his own perceived brilliance. He scanned the front row of tables until his sharp, judgmental eyes landed squarely on me and Liam. We were standing off to the side near the lavish dessert station. Liam looked incredibly uncomfortable staring down at the polished marble floor. I stood perfectly straight, my facial expression entirely neutral. "Of course we cannot all be visionaries like Devon," Thomas announced into the microphone. His tone shifted from celebratory to deeply condescending. The entire room went completely silent, sensing the sudden sharp change in the atmosphere. Thomas leaned closer to the microphone, making sure his voice carried to every single corner of the massive ballroom. "Some of us are content being entirely mediocre. Some people are perfectly happy living quiet, uninspired, and completely average lives, just coasting along without ambition or drive. Isn't that right, Liam Page?" A heavy, uncomfortable murmur rippled through the elite crowd. Several guests turned to stare at us. It was a brutal, calculated public humiliation. Thomas was using his grandest moment to intentionally crush his own son and degrade his daughter-in-law in front of Atlanta high society. He wanted to make it absolutely clear that Devon was the ultimate standard of success, while Liam and I were nothing more than truly embarrassing disappointments. Liam shrank back physically, his face flushing a deep, painful shade of crimson. He looked utterly destroyed by his father's vicious words. He did not speak up. He did not defend our marriage or our lives. He simply absorbed the harsh public abuse, just like he always did. "But tonight," Thomas yelled, bringing his focus back to the center of the room, "tonight we do not focus on the unremarkable. Tonight we celebrate true greatness, to Devon." The crowd cheered again, completely, ignoring the cruel insult that had just been hurled in our direction. They drank their expensive champagne, eager to align themselves with the man who supposedly held the keys to infinite wealth. I did not raise my glass. I did not look away in shame. I kept my eyes locked directly onto Devon. Devon was not looking at Thomas. He was not looking at his cheering wife. He was looking down at his sleek, expensive smartphone. His thumbs were furiously tapping the dark screen over and over again. He was desperately trying to access his offshore banking portals, hoping against hope that the federal security freeze had miraculously been lifted. But the glowing screen remained dark. The network was dead. His escape funds were completely gone. Sweat was pouring down his forehead, soaking the crisp collar of his custom tuxedo shirt. His broad chest heaved as he struggled to catch his breath. The walls of his fake empire were crushing the air right out of his lungs. I slowly raised my left wrist and glanced down at the glowing face of my smartwatch. The digital numbers ticked forward with cold mechanical precision. 3 minutes until breach. The armored transport vehicles were idling in the loading docks while heavily armed agents stacked up. I lowered my wrist and brought my crystal glass to my lips. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my drink, my eyes locked onto Devon. He was sweating profusely as he stared in horror at his dead phone, completely unaware that his destruction was already waiting just outside the doors. I turned my back on the stage and slipped away from the dessert station, leaving Liam to wallow in his own misery. The ballroom floor was a sea of expensive silk and tailored tuxedo jackets, a perfect camouflage for a federal agent preparing to light a match. I moved through the crowd with quiet purpose, my eyes scanning the room for the specific group of men I had researched on my secure laptop earlier today. These were not just random country club acquaintances. These were the heavy hitters, the apex predators of Atlanta real estate and commercial banking, who had eagerly handed millions of dollars over to Devon. I spotted them gathered near a towering ice sculpture, laughing loudly and congratulating themselves on their financial brilliance. Their leader was a silver-haired real estate mogul named Richard, a man who had leveraged 3 commercial high-rises to buy into that fake cryptocurrency fund. I approached their circle with a bright, innocent smile plastered across my face, perfectly playing the role of the naive, unimportant daughter-in-law. Richard noticed me approaching and offered a stiff, polite nod. He clearly recognized me from Thomas's brutal public insult moments ago. The men in the circle shifted slightly, making just enough room for me to stand near the edge of their conversation. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and mild annoyance, entirely unaware that I held the keys to their impending financial ruin. "Good evening, gentlemen," I said, keeping my voice light and breathy. "I hope you are all enjoying the celebration tonight. Thomas certainly knows how to throw an extravagant party." Richard chuckled, taking a slow sip from his heavy crystal tumbler of bourbon. He does indeed, Paige, Richard replied with a patronizing tone. Your father-in-law has every right to celebrate. The returns Devon has generated for our private portfolio group this quarter are nothing short of miraculous. We were just discussing how fortunate we are to be on the ground floor of this operation. It takes serious guts to navigate the digital markets the way he does. I nodded enthusiastically, letting my smile widen into something that looked like genuine awe. Oh, absolutely, I agreed, leaning in slightly closer to the group of wealthy investors. Devon is incredibly bold. In fact, I was just telling Liam how amazed I am by the sheer scale of the operation. Devon was just telling us how you all signed off on moving the entire portfolio to unregulated Cayman accounts for the massive Dubai expansion. Such a bold move. I really admire how much trust you gentlemen place in him to handle international transfers of that magnitude without any federal oversight. The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. I watched the collective reaction hit the group like a physical shockwave. The arrogant, self-satisfied laughter died instantly. Richard lowered his bourbon glass, his hand suddenly rigid. The healthy flesh color drained rapidly from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. The other men in the circle exchanged rapid, terrified glances. Their expensive smiles completely vanished. What did you just say? Richard asked. His voice was suddenly tight, stripped of all its previous warmth and condescension. He took a step toward me, his heavy brow furrowing in deep confusion and rising panic. Did you just say unregulated Cayman accounts? And a Dubai expansion? Devon never presented any proposals regarding international expansion or offshore asset relocation to the board. Our capital is supposed to be secured in domestic, heavily regulated holding accounts right here in Georgia. I feigned a look of sudden, intense embarrassment. I brought my hand up to cover my mouth, acting as though I had just accidentally spilled a massive family secret. Oh my goodness, I gasped softly, widening my eyes in perfect mock horror. Please tell me you knew about that. I am so sorry, I assumed you were fully aware since it is your capital. Devon and Brittany were rushing around the house at 4 o'clock this morning, securing first-class tickets to Dubai. Brittany even used my credit card to finalize the travel arrangements because his domestic accounts were temporarily frozen for the international wire transfers. I thought it was just a standard part of the corporate relocation process. I really hope I am not speaking out of turn. Please just pretend I never said anything. The panic spread through the wealthy investors like wildfire. The seeds of doubt had been planted directly in the fertile soil of their greed, and the roots were taking hold with violent speed. A younger investor in a sharp navy tuxedo pulled out his smartphone, his fingers trembling as he tried to open his private banking application. Frozen, he whispered, looking up at Richard with wide, terrified eyes. He said his domestic accounts are frozen. Richard, if he moved the capital offshore without our authorization, we have absolutely zero legal protection. It is a total breach of fiduciary duty. We cannot track that money if it hits the Cayman network. Richard did not respond immediately. His eyes darted frantically across the crowded ballroom, searching for Devon. He spotted the fake hedge fund manager still standing near the edge of the stage, sweating profusely and staring obsessively at his dead cell phone. The visual confirmation was utterly damning. Devon looked exactly like a man who was desperately trying to flee a burning building. The celebratory atmosphere of the gala began to warp and twist into something deeply paranoid. The men in his circle immediately splintered off, grabbing the arms of other wealthy investors and furiously whispering the terrifying news. The rumor moved through the country club with terrifying velocity. I stood back and watched the chaos quietly bloom. The clinking of crystal champagne glasses ceased entirely. The polite, superficial laughter was rapidly replaced by urgent, angry murmurs. The entire lavish ballroom was transforming into a pressure cooker. The elite crowd was finally waking up to the truth, oblivious to the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Thomas marched back up the small set of stairs leading to the main stage. He was completely blind to the angry murmurs spreading through his wealthy guests. He grabbed the microphone with a wide, arrogant grin, determined to force the room back into a state of blind celebration. The string quartet in the corner of the ballroom began playing a lively, upbeat melody at his visual command. Thomas raised his crystal champagne flute high above his head, the expensive liquid catching the light of the massive chandeliers. "May I have your attention one more time?" Thomas bellowed into the microphone, his voice booming over the sound of the anxious crowd. "We have heard the whispers of massive expansion and incredible new ventures tonight. Devon has truly outdone himself. I want every single person in this room to raise a glass to the man of the hour, to Devon and to the absolute pinnacle of financial brilliance." He waited for the enthusiastic applause that had echoed through the hall just minutes before, but the response was deafening silence. Not a single glass was raised. Richard and the other elite investors stood frozen, their eyes locked on Devon with expressions of pure, unadulterated fury. Devon was practically vibrating with terror, taking a step backward until his shoulders hit the heavy velvet curtain behind the stage. He realized the crowd knew. The illusion was dead. Then the true reality crashed into the room. Just as Thomas opened his mouth to demand applause, a thunderous crash violently shook the entire building. The heavy, solid mahogany doors at the main entrance of the country club were thrown open with such immense force that the brass handles slammed into the plaster walls, leaving deep, jagged craters. Sensory overload hit the lavish ballroom in an instant. The elegant string quartet stopped playing abruptly, a sharp, discordant screech of a violin bow cutting through the air as the musicians scrambled backward in fear. The polite, insulated silence of the country club was absolutely obliterated by the deafening, high-pitched wail of federal sirens screaming from the front parking lot. The noise was blindingly loud, vibrating right through the polished marble floors and rattling the crystal glasses sitting on the tables. Brilliant strobing flashes of red and blue, emergency lights pierced through the intricate stained glass windows lining the eastern wall of the hall. The colorful reflections danced frantically across the terrified faces of the elite guests, washing over the expensive evening gowns and tailored tuxedos in a dizzying, chaotic rhythm. 20 Federal Bureau of Investigation agents poured through the shattered entrance in perfect synchronized tactical formation. They moved with a level of speed and aggression that completely paralyzed the wealthy crowd. Every agent wore heavy, dark tactical gear, Kevlar vests boldly emblazoned with the bright yellow letters indicating their federal authority. Their heavy combat boots pounded against the pristine marble floors as they fanned out across the massive room. "Secure the perimeter!" The lead tactical commander shouted, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "Nobody moves. Nobody leaves this room. Keep your hands where we can see them. Do exactly as you are told, and no one will get hurt tonight." The tactical agents moved with ruthless efficiency. Within 10 seconds, every single exit was heavily barricaded. The kitchen doors, the patio French windows, and the main hallway archways were blocked by armed federal officers. The wealthy investors' people, who were used to dictating the terms of reality, suddenly found themselves completely powerless, trapped inside their own exclusive playground. Several guests gasped in horror. Women clutched their pearl necklaces and backed away slowly. Men raised their hands defensively, their eyes darting wildly around the room. Brittany let out a piercing, hysterical shriek, dropping her champagne flute. The delicate glass shattered against the floor, spraying expensive liquor across the hem of her emerald green gown. She grabbed Devon by the arm, frantically shaking him, demanding that he do something to fix the terrifying situation. Devon was completely paralyzed, his mouth hanging open as he stared at the tactical team blocking his only path to freedom. Thomas, however, did not freeze in fear. His massive, unchecked ego simply could not process the fact that his authority was being completely disregarded. He firmly believed his extreme wealth made him entirely immune to the law. His face flushed a dark, angry purple as he stomped down the stage steps and marched directly toward the center of the ballroom to confront the federal agents. "What is the meaning of this outrage?" Thomas roared, his voice shaking with absolute fury. He aggressively pointed his finger at the lead tactical commander, treating the heavily armed federal agent like a disobedient valet parking attendant. "You are trespassing on private property. This is a highly exclusive private event." The lead agent did not even blink. He maintained a strong defensive posture, his hand resting near his utility belt. "Step back, sir," the agent commanded firmly, his tone completely devoid of any respect for the angry billionaire. "We are executing a federal search and seizure warrant." Maintain your distance and remain completely silent. Thomas let out a harsh, incredulous scoff, puffing out his chest to look as intimidating as possible. He took another aggressive step forward, completely blind to the severe danger he was putting himself in. "You have absolutely no right to storm into my building like common thugs," Thomas shouted, his face inches from the agent. "Do you know who I am? I pay the police commissioner's salary. I fund the campaigns of the judges in this city. Get out of my club immediately before I end your entire career. Do you hear me? Leave my property right this second. I am the most powerful man in Atlanta. You cannot simply walk in here and ruin my son-in-law's celebration. I demand you lower your weapons and step outside while I make a phone call to your superiors." The lead tactical commander did not reach for his radio. He did not flinch at the absurd threats hurling from Thomas. He looked at the enraged billionaire with complete icy indifference. To a man who spent his life destroying crime syndicates, Thomas was nothing more than a loud obstacle standing in the way of a federal operation. The agent did not offer an explanation or ask for permission. He simply stepped sideways, bypassing the sputtering patriarch, entirely treating the supposed king of Atlanta real estate like a minor inconvenience. Thomas was left standing there with his finger pointed at empty air, his mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. No one had ever ignored him before. The dismissal stripped away his remaining authority instantly. The commander signaled with two brief hand gestures, directing his squad to maintain the strict blockade on all exits. Then he walked straight down the center aisle of the ballroom. The wealthy elite, the millionaires and politicians who had spent the evening bragging about their untouchable status, scrambled frantically out of his path. They parted like the sea, pressing their silk gowns and custom tuxedos against the banquet tables to avoid any physical contact with the heavily armed federal officer. The loud thud of his tactical boots echoed clearly across the polished marble floor, each footstep sounding like a judge banging a gavel. I remained standing near the dessert station, my posture straight, my hands resting calmly at my sides. I did not retreat into the shadows. I did not hide behind my cowardly husband. I watched the commander approach, feeling the grounding rush of federal protocol taking over the chaotic room. The guests surrounding me began to pull away, assuming the agent was coming to interrogate us. Liam instinctively took 3 large steps backward, his face drained of all color, desperately trying to distance himself from the incoming federal threat. He abandoned me instantly, proving one final time exactly what kind of man he truly was. I stood my ground, completely isolated from the terrified crowd. The commander closed the final distance between us. He stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me, his tall, imposing frame blocking out the glare of the crystal chandeliers. For a brief second, the entire country club held its collective breath. Everyone in the room expected him to draw a pair of handcuffs and arrest the quiet, unassuming daughter-in-law. They expected the boring administrative assistant to collapse into a puddle of tears. Instead, the heavy tension in the air shattered in a completely different direction. The commander straightened his posture, brought his right hand up to the brim of his tactical helmet, and delivered a perfectly executed military salute. He dropped his hand and nodded his head with profound, unmistakable respect. His voice rang out clearly, carrying across the silent, stunned ballroom. "Special Agent Page," the commander announced, his tone entirely formal and strictly professional. "The perimeter is fully secured. All hostiles are contained. The target is on site, awaiting your direct orders, ma'am." A violent collective gasp ripped through the massive hall. The sound was a visceral, physical wave of absolute shock, hitting hundreds of people simultaneously. At the center of the room, Thomas turned around just in time to hear the commander address me by my official federal title. The sheer impossibility of the situation struck him with the force of a freight train. His arrogant purple face drained to a sickly ash gray. The expensive crystal champagne flute he had been clutching suddenly slipped from his loose, trembling fingers. It plummeted toward the ground and hit the hard marble floor, shattering into 1,000 glittering pieces. The sharp crash of breaking glass echoed violently through the silent room, but Thomas did not even look down. He stared at me, his eyes wide and bulging, his mind completely unable to process the fact that he had spent years insulting a senior federal investigator. A few feet away, my mother-in-law, Barbara, let out a choked wheeze. She brought both hands up to cover her mouth, her pearl necklace rattling against her chest as she stumbled backward into a banquet table. This was the woman who had spent the morning telling her social circle that I was a desperate peasant trying to buy my way into her family. She had just introduced me to a state senator as a lowly paper pusher. Now she was watching a heavily armed tactical unit defer directly to my absolute authority. The embarrassment and raw terror visibly crushed her perfectly maintained high society facade. She looked physically ill, grasping the edge of the table just to keep herself from collapsing. The most devastating reaction belonged to the man cowering to my left. Liam stood frozen, his eyes locked onto my face as if staring at an unrecognizable ghost. His jaw hung slack. His breath came in short, panicked bursts. He had spent 4 years believing he was the superior partner in our marriage. He demanded I shrink myself, silence my opinions, and endure abuse to appease his family. He thought I was weak. He thought I was entirely dependent on his meager protection. The realization that he had been sleeping next to a federal agent broke his brain. He realized in real time that my silence had never been submission. My silence had always been an active, calculated investigation. Up on the main stage, the reality of the situation finally hit the actual criminals. Brittany let out a low moan, her knees buckling beneath her expensive green gown. She grabbed onto the velvet curtain to stop herself from hitting the floor, looking like she was about to faint. She had stolen a federal bait card. She had insulted a federal agent. She was absolutely doomed. Devin was paralyzed, trapped between the stairs and the locked doors, staring at me with the horrifying realization that I was the architect of his destruction. The federal trap had perfectly and permanently snapped shut. I stepped forward, leaving my paralyzed husband behind in the dark shadows of the dessert station. The heavy, suffocating silence in the grand ballroom was absolutely deafening. Hundreds of terrified eyes followed my every single movement as I walked slowly toward the main stage. The wealthy elite, who had proudly looked down their noses at me all evening, now physically shrank back in pure terror. I ascended the velvet-lined stairs to the elevated platform. Thomas was standing completely frozen near the absolute center of the large room, staring right at me with a vacant and totally shattered expression on his aging face. He had dropped his microphone on a cocktail table before confronting the tactical agents. I picked it up. The metal felt powerful in my hand. I tapped the top twice. The sharp thud echoed through the massive speakers, demanding the immediate attention of every person in the building. I stood directly under the harsh glare of the center spotlight, looking down at the sea of expensive designer gowns. Barbara was leaning heavily against a catered banquet table, her pale face completely buried in her trembling hands. Liam was actively hiding behind a floral arrangement, unable to face his cowardice. Finally, my eyes locked onto Thomas. His arrogant posture had collapsed. I brought the microphone to my lips. I spoke with cold, absolute authority, the kind of authority that cannot be bought. Yesterday, at exactly 4 in the morning, my entitled sister-in-law deliberately stole my personal credit card. I announced to the entirely dead silent room. My calm voice cut through the tense air like a sharp blade. I caught her red-handed in the kitchen of the estate. When I confronted her directly, she laughed straight in my face. My own father-in-law coldly told me I was a cheap peasant and arrogantly said she would never do such a thing in her entire life. He aggressively threatened to fire his own son and throw us out on the street if I did not sign a forged document covering up her felony crime. He fiercely protected a thief because he truly thought his massive wealth placed his entire family completely above the law. Shocked gasps rippled through the crowd. Investors turned to glare directly at Thomas. His reputation as an honorable patriarch was disintegrating in real time. He tried to speak, but no words came out. What none of you knew, I continued, raising my voice, is that she stole a federal bait card. It is a highly classified instrument used to track international money laundering. The moment she used that card, she triggered a massive federal security sweep. I turned away from Thomas and shifted my focus directly onto Devin. The tall man was pressing his back against the velvet curtain, trying to merge with the shadows. The fake Patek Philippe watch on his wrist caught the glare of the police lights. And because of that $20,000 transaction for two one-way tickets to Dubai, my system automatically audited the linked accounts. I stated clearly. My eyes swept over Richard and the men who had proudly bragged about their offshore Cayman Islands portfolios. I watched their faces turn a sickening shade of gray as the truth dawned on them. Devon is no broker, I declared, letting the harsh words strike the room like a physical blow. He is a con artist. The ballroom erupted. Dozens of incredibly furious voices broke out all at once. Richard surged forward, demanding to know what I meant. Federal agents instantly raised their hands, ordering the crowd to step back. The tactical commander stepped toward the stage, ensuring my safety as I dismantled the criminal empire. I held up my free right hand, demanding total silence. The sheer force of my federal authority brought the wealthy crowd back to a sudden, terrified hush. Hai is running a massive Ponzi scheme, I explained. There are no foreign cryptocurrency markets. Devon has been taking your millions and using them to pay fake dividends to early investors while skimming a massive percentage off the top. He used his marriage to Brittany to gain access to your exclusive circles. He used Thomas as a gullible pawn to legitimize his fraudulent fund. He targeted every one of you because your arrogance made you easy marks. I looked down at Richard, who was now clutching his chest. You thought you were financial geniuses, I said coldly. But you handed your entire fortunes over to a man without a basic securities license. He set up a massive complex web of offshore shell companies to hide his criminal tracks. The federal algorithm sliced right through his fake registries in mere seconds. We have his master ledger, we have his hidden banking logs, we have concrete proof of every stolen dollar. Devon let out a desperate sound. He tried to scramble sideways along the edge of the stage, looking for a blind spot in the tactical perimeter. He knew he was utterly trapped, but panic forced him to seek an escape. The offshore accounts are completely empty, I announced. The incoming capital dried up. Devon realized he could not cover the massive dividend payouts scheduled for Monday morning. The entire illusion was set to violently collapse. That is exactly why he and his desperate wife Brittany were frantically trying to flee the country to Dubai before tomorrow morning ever arrived. They were going to leave all of you, including Thomas, completely bankrupt to face the catastrophic fallout while they vanished into the desert. I slowly lowered the microphone to my side. The absolute horrifying truth hung in the cold air, heavy and completely undeniable. The lavish country club with its imported caviar and massive crystal chandeliers suddenly felt like a massive freezing tomb for the extraordinarily wealthy. The elite guests were no longer blindly celebrating greatness. They were mourning the total destruction of their financial futures ruined by the man they worshipped just minutes ago. Devon snapped. The paralyzing terror that had rooted him to the side of the stage finally shattered, completely overrun by the primal, desperate instinct of a cornered predator. He looked wildly around the room, his bloodshot eyes locking onto the heavy swinging doors leading into the catering kitchen. A single federal agent stood a few feet away from that specific exit, momentarily distracted by a wealthy investor attempting to push past the perimeter. Devon saw the tiny sliver of an opening. He abandoned all pretense of innocence, lowered his broad shoulders, and sprinted directly toward the kitchen doors. He moved forward with sudden explosive speed, his custom tuxedo jacket flapping open as he desperately pushed a catering table out of his path. Silver trays of imported appetizers crashed violently to the marble floor, but Devon did not look back. He honestly believed his physical size and raw adrenaline could carry him right through the federal blockade and out into the loading dock alleyway. I was spectacularly wrong. The tactical agents were certainly not slow, complacent country club security guards. They were highly trained federal operatives who had anticipated his exact flight path the moment they breached the building. Before Devon could even reach out to push the swinging wooden doors, two massive agents converged on him from opposite angles. They moved with terrifying synchronized precision. The first agent hit Devon directly in the midsection, driving a heavily armored shoulder right into the con artist's ribs. All the air left Devon's lungs in a loud, harsh gasp. Simultaneously, the second agent swept his legs out from under him. Devon was forcefully thrown backward. His heavy frame slammed brutally against the cold marble floor. The sickening thud of the impact echoed through the dead silent ballroom. Devon groaned out loud in absolute bone-crushing agony, trying weakly to thrash against the immense pressure pinning him to the ground. The agents did not hesitate. One drove a knee sharply into his spine, while the other wrenched his arms behind his back. The sharp, unmistakable sound of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists snapped through the quiet air. Click, click, click. That sharp metallic sound finalized the total destruction of his fraudulent empire. The man who had stolen millions, who had arrogantly thrown counterfeit cash at me in my own kitchen, was now lying face down in spilled champagne and crushed caviar. Brittany let out a blood-curdling scream. The sound tore from her throat raw and utterly hysterical. Seeing her husband pinned to the floor finally broke through her thick wall of lifelong delusion. She lunged forward, her expensive emerald green gown catching on an overturned chair. She stumbled hard over the debris, but kept screaming loudly, clawing her way through the paralyzed crowd of elite guests. She reached out her manicured hands, violently demanding the officers release her husband immediately. She screamed that they were making a massive mistake, that her family was incredibly wealthy, and that she would have every single one of them fired by morning. She never made it to Devon. A female tactical agent stepped smoothly into her path, grabbing Brittany firmly by the upper arms and effortlessly spinning her around. Another agent immediately secured her wrists behind her back. Brittany thrashed wildly, sobbing and demanding to speak to her father, completely oblivious to the fact that her father had absolutely no power here. The lead tactical commander stepped right into her line of sight, his face a mask of cold, unyielding federal authority. I did not care about her designer dress or her country club membership. "Brittany, you are under arrest," the commander stated, his voice cutting clearly through her hysterical sobbing. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. You are being charged with multiple counts of federal wire fraud, international money laundering, and active conspiracy to flee the country to evade federal prosecution." The Miranda rights hit her like a physical blow. The golden child of Atlanta high society, the woman who had spent her entire life treating everyone else like disposable peasants, was now a common federal criminal, being read her rights in front of every single person she had ever tried to impress. Her legs finally gave out completely. The agents had to physically hold her upright as she continued to weep uncontrollably, her perfect life entirely reduced to ashes in a matter of seconds. At the front of the room, Thomas was shaking violently. His entire worldview had just been detonated right in front of his eyes. The man he praised as a visionary was in handcuffs. His beautiful, untouchable daughter was being hauled away by federal agents. He pushed his way through the stunned crowd, his face a deep, alarming shade of crimson. He marched right up to the edge of the stage, looking up at me with wild, desperate eyes. He refused to accept the reality unfolding around him. "Paige!" Thomas demanded, his voice cracking with a mixture of raw fury and rising panic. "Tell them to stop this right now. You fix this immediately. What is going on with my money?" "I gave Devon full power of attorney over my entire portfolio." "What did you mean when you said the accounts are empty? I demand answers right this second." I looked down at the man who had threatened to destroy my marriage and throw me on the street just 12 hours earlier. I did not step back. I did not soften my tone or offer him a single ounce of comfort. I looked him dead in the eye, delivering the final fatal blow with absolute unwavering clarity. "Your retirement is gone, Thomas," I said, making sure every word landed perfectly. "Devon liquidated your estate to pay off his early investors. You are completely, utterly bankrupt." The absolute finality of my words hung in the air, striking Thomas with the devastating force of a physical blow. The proud, arrogant patriarch of Atlanta high society physically crumpled. His knees buckled slightly, and he had to grab the edge of the wooden stage just to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. His mouth opened and closed in rapid succession, but no sound came out. The reality of his complete financial annihilation had finally bypassed his massive ego. I was now staring deeply into an abyss of absolute poverty, and the sheer terror in his eyes was magnificent to witness. Behind him, the chaotic scene continued to unfold. Federal agents were actively securing evidence, taking photographs of the lavish country club event and leading the handcuffed criminals toward the exits. The wealthy investors who had previously worshipped Thomas were now screaming demands at the tactical officers, desperately trying to salvage whatever pennies remained of their offshore portfolios. Suddenly, a frantic movement near the floral arrangements caught my attention. Liam, my cowardly husband, finally snapped out of his paralyzing shock. The illusion of his perfect, untouchable family had been violently ripped away, leaving him entirely exposed. He pushed his way past a group of terrified socialites, stumbling over the hem of a discarded silk tablecloth. His face was a mask of pure, desperate panic. He scrambled up the velvet-lined stairs of the stage, breathing heavily, his eyes wide and completely wild. He ran directly toward me, abandoning all his previous hesitation. He reached out and grabbed both of my hands, his grip tight and frantic. His palms were incredibly sweaty, shaking with the raw adrenaline of a man watching his entire life burn to the ground. Tears were actively streaming down his pale face, ruining his carefully groomed appearance. "Paige, you have to stop this!" Liam cried, his voice cracking loudly over the chaotic noise of the ballroom. His tone was begging, pleading, completely stripped of any pride. "Tell them it is a mistake. Tell the agents that Devon is just confused about the accounts. You work for the government. You are in charge here. Use your badge to help us. Please, Paige, you have to save my family." I stared down at his trembling hands clutching mine. This was the exact same man who had physically pulled me away from Devon in the kitchen to force my submission. This was the man who had actively turned his back while a massive criminal cornered me against a marble island and threatened my life. He had spent 4 years demanding that I shrink myself, silence my voice, and endure endless psychological abuse, just so he could maintain his comfortable, mediocre existence in his father's shadow. Now, when the bill for their collective arrogance had finally come due, he expected me to magically fix everything. He expected me to sacrifice my federal career and my moral integrity to protect the very people who had treated me like disposable garbage. A cold, powerful wave of absolute clarity washed over my entire body. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for the man sobbing in front of me. I violently yanked my hands away from his desperate grip. Liam stumbled forward, slightly thrown off balance by the sudden aggressive rejection. I unclasped the smooth metal lock of my sleek designer clutch. Reaching inside my fingers, bypassed my federal credentials and closed around a thick folded manila envelope. I had prepared this document weeks ago, waiting for the perfect moment to execute my own personal exit strategy. The envelope contained the culmination of months of legal preparation secured completely independently of his family's vast network of corrupt attorneys. I pulled the crisp manila envelope from my clutch. With a swift, deliberate motion, I slapped the heavy paper packet directly against Liam's chest. The sharp thud echoed between us. Liam instinctively brought his hands up, catching the envelope before it could fall to the wooden stage floor. He looked down at the blank paper, his tear-filled eyes darting back up to my face in total confusion. "I am not your savior, Liam," I stated, my voice echoing with icy, unyielding finality. "I am your soon-to-be ex-wife. Those are divorce papers. You stood by and watched them abuse me for years. You watched a man threaten me in my own kitchen and did nothing. Enjoy the ruins." Liam gasped, his jaw dropping open. He clutched the envelope tightly, physically recoiling as if the paper itself had severely burned his hands. I did not wait for his response. I did not care to hear his pathetic apologies or his desperate excuses. I turned my back on him. I turned my back on Thomas, who was now weeping loudly near the edge of the stage. I turned my back on the screaming, crying, devastated family that had once tried to completely break my spirit. I did not care about the years I had wasted trying to earn their approval. I did not care about the lavish holidays or the fake smiles they had forced me to endure. They were no longer my problem. They were just another closed federal case file gathering dust in a government archive. The entire nightmare was finally ending right here. I walked down the velvet-lined stage stairs with perfect measured steps, my heels clicking softly against the marble. The remaining terrified guests parted from me automatically, offering a wide, perfectly clear path directly to the main entrance. I strode confidently through the massive wooden country club doors, leaving the suffocating atmosphere of fake wealth and shattered egos entirely behind me. I stepped out into the cool night air. The intense red and blue emergency lights from the fleet of federal vehicles washed over my face in a steady, rhythmic pulse. The crisp autumn breeze felt incredibly refreshing and revitalizing against my warm skin. I took a deep, cleansing breath, embracing the absolute silence of the perfectly cool autumn night as I finally walked away from them forever. 6 months have passed since that spectacular evening at the country club, and the crushing weight of the federal justice system has ground the remnants of that arrogant family into fine, indistinguishable powder. The brutal consequences of their actions were swift, public, and entirely irreversible. Devon faced a highly publicized trial that became the ultimate media circus for the Atlanta financial district. The man who once strutted through a marble kitchen bragging about multi-million-dollar crypto hedge funds stood before a strict federal judge wearing a standard-issue bright orange prison jumpsuit. The prosecution presented the master ledger I had pulled directly from his encrypted offshore accounts. The evidence was so overwhelmingly flawless that his own highly paid defense attorneys begged him to take a plea deal. It took the jury less than 2 hours to return a unanimous guilty verdict. The judge showed absolutely zero mercy. Devon was sentenced to 15 solid years in a high-security federal penitentiary for wire fraud, international money laundering, and operating a massive predatory Ponzi scheme. There are no custom-tailored silk pajamas, expensive cigars, or fake luxury watches in federal prison. He will spend the next decade and a half locked in a tiny concrete cell, stripped of his fraudulent pride and entirely forgotten by the wealthy elite he tried so desperately to con. Brittany barely avoided sharing a cold cell block with her criminal husband. When the federal agents presented her with the staggering reality of her stolen flight tickets and her direct complicity in the escape plan, her absolute arrogance shattered completely. Desperate to save herself from a lengthy prison sentence, she immediately turned state evidence. She traded every single secret Devon had ever told her in exchange for a highly restrictive suspended sentence. But receiving immunity from federal prison did not grant her immunity from total financial ruin. The government seized absolutely everything she owned: the emerald green designer gowns, the luxury imported vehicles, the expensive diamond jewelry. All of it was ruthlessly auctioned off by the state to provide restitution to the countless defrauded investors. Today, the former undisputed queen of Atlanta high society lives in a cramped, dark, windowless studio apartment on the absolute worst side of the city. To survive, she currently works the overnight shift at a local fast food drive-thru. Every single night, she stands under harsh fluorescent lights, handing greasy paper bags and cheap sodas through a small window to the exact same type of working-class people she used to openly mock. She earns basic minimum wage, desperately trying to pay off a massive mountain of lingering legal debt, her glamorous life permanently erased. Thomas and Barbara suffered the most poetic and devastating downfall of all. Because Thomas had foolishly and blindly given Devon full power of attorney over his entire portfolio, the bank forcefully foreclosed on the massive vacation estate and their primary residence to cover the massive predatory loans Devon had secretly secured. They were evicted from their own fortress of wealth. Their elite friends, the politicians and real estate moguls they had tried so hard to impress, completely abandoned them overnight. They were treated like highly toxic social pariahs. The exclusive country club permanently revoked their membership. Now, Thomas and Barbara live entirely on basic Social Security checks in a dilapidated, rusting trailer park 50 miles outside the city limits. The powerful patriarch who once boldly claimed he controlled the police commissioner now spends his miserable days aggressively arguing with his impoverished neighbors over shared parking spaces and noise complaints. Barbara no longer wears heavy pearl necklaces or hosts lavish catered brunches. She sits in a tiny, cramped living room, staring blankly at a small television forever, mourning the loss of the pristine pastel-colored aesthetic she used to weaponize against me. Liam signed the official divorce papers incredibly quietly and without putting up a single fight during the extremely brief legal mediation process. He had absolutely nothing left to protect and zero money to hire a competent lawyer. Last I heard, my cowardly ex-husband was working as a junior sales associate at a low-end used car dealership, finally forced to face the harsh realities of the real world without his father's massive protective shadow to hide behind. As for me, my life took a completely different upward trajectory. The highly successful takedown of Devon's international money laundering ring did not go unnoticed by the executive higher-ups at the Bureau. I am currently sitting comfortably in my brand new, incredibly spacious and beautifully decorated corner office, located right in the heart of the capital city. I look out through massive floor-to-ceiling windows at the beautiful, inspiring view of the Capitol building. I have been officially promoted to the highly prestigious and critical role of Deputy Director of Cybersecurity. I now oversee hundreds of elite federal agents and manage critical national threat responses on a daily basis. My desk is made of solid, heavy oak, but unlike Thomas's dark and oppressive old study, this room is filled with bright natural light and a genuine, profound sense of purpose. I do not have to shrink myself, silence my opinions, or endure psychological abuse to fit into anyone else's toxic narrative anymore. I built my own powerful and successful empire, using nothing but my sharp intellect, my federal training, and my absolute unwavering refusal to ever be a victim. Have you ever caught a toxic family member stealing only to have the rest of the family defend them? How did you get your revenge? Let me know in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of justice served cold.